Most people who struggle with low self-esteem don't know they do. Not because they're unaware that something is off, but because what they feel has already been given a different name. A more acceptable one. A permanent one. They've been told, or they've told themselves, that they're just introverted, just a perfectionist, just realistic about their abilities. Just someone who prefers to listen rather than speak. These explanations feel like self-knowledge. They feel like clarity. But for a lot of people, they are something else entirely. They are the reason the possibility of change never quite arrives. This video is going to name 7 patterns that get misclassified as personality almost every time. Not to give you a diagnosis, not to suggest something is wrong with you, but to offer you a different explanation. One that doesn't close the door before you've had a chance to look through it. Here's the thing about personality traits. They feel native. They feel like they were there before anything happened to you. And when a behavior has been with you long enough that you can't remember not having it, it starts to feel exactly like that. Like it arrived with you. Like it's yours in the way your eye color is yours. But there's a difference between something that is constitutive, meaning built into who you are, and something that is adaptive. Adaptive means you learned it. Your nervous system developed it in response to something. It became automatic because it was useful, or because it felt safer than the alternative, or because it kept you from getting hurt in a specific way that mattered at the time. And adaptive behaviors, practiced consistently enough over enough years, look and feel identical to personality. That is not a flaw in your self-awareness. That's just how deeply learned patterns work. The question this video is going to ask 7 times is a simple one. Not, do you have this trait? But, what are the 2 possible explanations for this? And which one actually opens something when you hold it? One explanation closes the door. The other one leaves it slightly ajar. That difference is everything. And before the objection arrives, because it will, and it's a fair one, yes, some of what feels like personality genuinely is. Not every quiet preference or natural inclination is a symptom of something. This video is not going to tell you that you don't know yourself. It's going to ask you to hold 2 explanations at once and notice which one fits more honestly. That's all. Now let's look at the first 4 signs. Sign 1. You've been calling it being hard on yourself or perfectionism. Most people who hold themselves to an unusually high standard, who revise the email 4 times, who rehearse the conversation the night before, who feel a specific drop in the chest when they make even a small mistake, have been told this is a strength, that it shows standards, that it means they care about quality. And sometimes, that's true. But there's a version of this that has nothing to do with standards. It's a monitoring system. A constant low-level check that runs before anything goes out. Anything that could be seen, evaluated, or judged. Asking, is this good enough yet to be safe? The inner critic isn't a personality trait. It's a protection mechanism that learned early on that certain kinds of visibility were dangerous, that being imperfect in certain ways attracted a specific kind of response that hurt. And so it built a process. It checks the work before the world gets to. That's not perfectionism. That's a nervous system doing the job it was trained to do. Sign 2. You've been calling it being humble, or not being a people pleaser about compliments. Someone says something kind to you, something that, if it landed, would actually feel good. And for a half second, something almost lands. Then the voice starts. They're just being nice. They didn't see me at my worst. If they knew the full picture, they wouldn't say that. You spend the next 30 seconds quietly dismantling a moment that was offered to you as a gift. This doesn't mean you're humble. It means your nervous system has learned to treat incoming positive information as a potential threat. Because at some point, believing something good about yourself and then having it contradicted hurt more than not believing it in the first place. Deflecting compliments is armor. It was built for a reason. Sign 3. You've been calling it being considerate, or being aware of your impact. The over-apology. The reflexive sorry before you've even assessed whether you've done anything wrong. Apologizing for taking up space at the table, for asking a question, for existing slightly inconveniently. It looks like consideration. It is often read as consideration. But what's actually happening, most of the time, is preemptive shrinking. It's a way of making yourself smaller before anyone else has the chance to suggest you should be. It comes from a learned belief, usually installed long before you had words for it, that your presence is, by default, a mild imposition, that you need to earn your space rather than simply occupy it. Sign 4. You've been calling it being perceptive or reading people well. You walk into a room and within about 40 seconds you have a detailed map of the social temperature. Who is in a good mood? Who seems distracted? Who glanced at you in a way that could mean something? You've always thought of this as intuition, as a social skill, and it can be genuinely. But there's a version of this that isn't a skill. It's a surveillance system. Your nervous system's scanning the environment constantly for incoming threat. Not because you're perceptive, because it learned at some point that not scanning was risky, that missing a shift in mood, in a room, in a person who had power over you, could cost you something. The hypervigilance was protection. It just never got the update that the original threat is no longer in every room you enter. Now let's look at the final 3, and at what the misclassification has actually cost. Sign 5. You've been calling it being a good listener, or not being the type who needs the spotlight. You stay quiet in groups, not because you don't have anything to say, you often do, but there is a gap between having the thought and speaking it. And in that gap, something happens. The voice checks. Is this worth saying? Is it interesting enough? Will it land wrong? Will I lose track of the sentence halfway through and have everyone looking at me while I search for the ending? By the time the check is done, the moment has moved on, and you've edited yourself out again. That is not a preference for listening. That is the specific exhaustion of monitoring your own contributions before they leave your mouth, of treating every sentence as a potential liability before it's even been spoken. Sign 6. You've been calling it being realistic, or knowing your limits. You don't apply for the thing, you don't send the message, you don't raise your hand, not because you've genuinely assessed your abilities and found them insufficient, but because, somewhere between the idea and the action, a verdict was already issued. Before anyone else got the chance to say no, you said it first. That's not realism. That is the preemptive self-rejection, the belief, operating mostly below the level of conscious thought, that the result of trying is likely to be exposure. And that exposure is likely to confirm the thing you've been most afraid to confirm, so it's safer not to find out. The cost of that safety is everything you didn't do. Sign 7. You've been calling it being selfless, or just not being high maintenance. You are generous. You show up when people need things. You are genuinely good at being there for others. But when something is offered to you, care, attention, help, love, something shifts. You minimize it. You redirect it. You feel a vague discomfort that doesn't fully resolve until you've made yourself useful again. This isn't selflessness. It's a pattern of earned presence. The belief that your value in a relationship, any relationship, is contingent on what you provide. That receiving, without giving something back immediately, puts you in a kind of debt. That love is not something you're owed simply for being here. It's something you work for. Every time. Here is why this matters. Not as a concept, not as an interesting reframe, but actually, for every year you call these things personality, they are unavailable for examination. You can't work on something you believe is constitutive. You can't shift something you've classified as permanent. The misclassification is not just semantic. It's operational. It determines what you think is possible. The job not applied for. The sentence not finished. The compliment deflected before it could land. The room left early, the thing you almost said. The person you almost let love you without bracing for it. You have been paying for this with things that mattered. And the misclassification, calling these patterns personality instead of what they actually are, is part of what kept the cost invisible. Naming the pattern is the first step, but there are layers underneath, specific ones, and knowing which layer is doing the most work in your particular experience changes everything about what to do next. There's a self-esteem diagnostic in the description called the mirror test. It takes about 20 minutes and it tells you, with a level of specificity this video can't, exactly where your self-worth architecture most needs attention. If this video opens something, that resource is where to go next. So here is the objection that's been sitting patiently since the beginning. But some of these genuinely feel like me. How do I know which ones are patterns and which ones are just how I'm built? That question deserves a real answer. Here's the distinguishing question. Not, does this feel natural? Because learned behaviors feel completely natural. That's the whole point. The question is, does this feel like freedom or does it feel like management? When you stay quiet in a group, is it because silence is genuinely where you find yourself, or because something is running a check before you're allowed to speak? when you don't apply for the opportunity? Is it a considered decision? Or does it happen so fast you barely notice there was a choice? When you deflect the compliment, do you feel settled afterward? Or does something quietly, that you just refuse something you actually wanted? Freedom feels like a decision. Management feels like a reflex. That's the distinction. Not perfect, not always clean, but navigable. You were not born with this. That's not a reassurance. That's what the research consistently shows about how self-worth patterns form. They develop early, in the feedback of repeated experiences, in the lessons absorbed from the people who had the most power over you when you were least equipped to evaluate what they were teaching. They became automatic because automatic meant fast, and fast meant protected. Your nervous system didn't make a mistake. It built a system that made sense given what it had to work with. The patterns in this video weren't installed by a flaw in you. They were installed by an environment, and by a version of you who was doing the only reasonable thing available, which was adapting. What changes when you reclassify something? Not everything, not immediately, but the category it lives in shifts. And the category it lives in determines whether change is on the table. Personality, permanent, constitutional, unavailable for revision, learned pattern, adaptive, historical, available, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely for something different. The one thing this video is asking you to do is not to fix any of these patterns today. It's to practice holding two explanations, the old one and the new one, and to notice, honestly, without pressure, which one opens something. If this opens something you want to go deeper on, the mirror test is in the description. It was built for exactly the moment after a video like this one, when the recognition has landed and you want to understand your own specific pattern. Links in the description and in the pinned comment. Which of these 7 did you already have a different name for? And what were you calling it? There is something specific that happens when a pattern gets named correctly for the first time. It doesn't disappear, it doesn't become easy, but it becomes visible in a way it wasn't before. And visible things can be worked with, invisible ones just run. For a long time, these patterns have been running under names that made them permanent, names that felt like honesty, names that made them yours, in a way that put them outside of examination. You have been carrying something that got classified wrong, not by carelessness, because it arrived so early and stayed so long and adapted so convincingly that of course it looked like identity. Of course it felt native. That is not evidence that it is. What you did today, spending this much time with something that usually lives below the surface, is not nothing. The part of you that brought you here, that sat with these 7 signs instead of scrolling past, that part already knew. It's been trying to get your attention for a while. You already know something shifted. The version of you that learned to call these things personality was making the only move available. No other explanation had been offered yet. You didn't have different words. Now you do. Words that say, this was learned. Words that say, learned things can, slowly, imperfectly, with the right support and enough honest attention, become something else. Words that say, what you've been calling your limits might actually be the edge of something that was built, not born. And things that were built can be rebuilt. You were not born with this. You are closer than you think. Keep going.